Hello, hi Fleur. I'm sorry that Mike cannot be here, but it's that's just how it goes in Parliament. You can never quite predict the timetable, and he's doing good work as MP for Manchester Airport, and I'm MP for Newcastle Airport. And I've just come from a meeting with Newcastle Airport, so I'll just switch my head from aviation to building back better from COVID, which I think we need to do on a whole range of fronts. But I think the Pope's guidance on this is certainly welcome. And we're really pleased to have Christine here, who's going to talk to us about what the thinking is. And then hopefully we'll have a chance for some questions and discussion as well. So Christine, are you happy to just, I think everyone here knows who you are. We're very grateful that Christine, we met recently. It feels recent, although I think it's just the nature of time at the moment. You never quite know if it's a day, a week, a month, or it was actually a year ago. But the last CAFOD meeting that we had, Christine very kindly set out some of the work that CAFOD's been doing to support across the world in terms of this COVID response, and put it all in perspective very much for us here in the UK. But I think we all want to start thinking about building back better out of this crisis. So I'll hand over to Christine to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks everybody. It's great to see you, particularly some good faces. A big hello to Hilary. It's fantastic to see you as well. But hello everyone. It's really fantastic to be with you today to have this discussion, and for you, I want to thank you for making time, and I know what is your very busy schedule. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, the context of COVID and that sense of building back better, flagging up a few kind of relevant issues for us, and ending with a bit of a call to action in which we can reflect a bit more on what that means for you, particularly as politicians. As we start a new year, still with the latest COVID restrictions, I think it's probably been harder for most of us, especially if we're dealing with children and school at home, and the dark days haven't helped. But for me, seeing the support of people like yourselves and the thousands of other CAFOD supporters really does lift my spirits. And of course, seeing the impact of the work of CAFOD around the world really helps me too. So I just want to say, from over the last year, we've had our COVID emergency appeal response appeal, and we've made 62 emergency and scale-up grant allocations across 27 countries to help partners respond to COVID. And that's been around £1.7 million. And a further £1.5 million of our existing general funds have also been repurposed for COVID responses at the request of our partners. And the kind of responses that we've made in the first wave have been things like preparedness and community awareness, PPE and education. But later tranches have included hygiene and medical supplies, and also food distribution, really important in the face of government lockdowns that have had such a devastating impact on many. But now we're starting to look at what does it mean to help do some post-pandemic kind of work, helping to continue our work on livelihoods and development in that way. And whether it be from our partners, but also our supporters here in England and Wales, I'm hearing a growing narrative that we can't just simply go back to the way things were. And many of you I know support CAFOD because of your faith and because of our imperative that our faith has about calling for more equitable sharing of the Earth's resources. And that Pope Francis has talked about us preparing the future, not just prepare for the future, but to prepare the future. And in Laudato Si, and more recently in Fratelli Tutti, he outlines what is and calls for a more radical conversion to a society where our politics and economics and our social organisation benefit our planet and all those who depend on it in a fair and just way. And in that context, it's a critical year for the UK. although the bandwidth might be focused, but might be limited by the focus on Brexit and COVID chaos, we can't lose sight of the opportunities for the UK on the global stage this year, particularly with the G7 and the COP negotiations later in the year. But there's a few points that I want to flag in relation to that. The first one is very topical, which is about the cuts to aid, which you wanted me to reflect on a little bit too. We do recognise the economic challenges that we face here at home, absolutely. But we oppose the government's proposed cuts to the Overseas Development Assistance budget. And more importantly, we want the quality of aid spending improved. CAFOD doesn't get a huge amount of government funding, so this is not just about us, but is about those around the world. And I know that the focus can be very much on the amount from 0.7 to 0.5%, but for us, the key question is the quality of aid. And it would be good, I think we really need more questions to be posed about the nature of the cuts and who is being really impacted on it. For instance, why is a body like CDC not facing a freeze when it has huge reserves of capital and with much more work still to do on its poverty metrics, for instance? The government's keeping its commitments to multilaterals. Well, that's good, but we've also flagged to the FCDO that civil society and local organisations often find it difficult to access funding, particularly in a timely way through the multilaterals. And of course, we need to continue to question both the multilaterals and government around localisation and the commitments that have been made in the grand bargain. And I guess when it comes down to the big number, the government argues about its finances. Well, I really don't think that the financial argument holds water when just a matter of weeks before the government had massively increased its spending on defence. So there's quite a lot that's very topical in relation to the aid cuts. Another key issue for us, obviously, as we move into the year where the UK hosts the climate negotiations, is around climate and climate justice. And I think as hosts of the COP, we do need to lead by example. And I know that some good commitments have been made, but they're words at the moment, and there is still so much to do. Now, you will hear as much as I do the arguments that, well, it's all down to the US and China, they all have to change. And yes, that's true. But as the hosts of the climate negotiations, I think, if we're not doing as much as we can, it undermines our potential for diplomatic leverage, of which there is such a need this year. I mean, it is great that Alok Sharma has been made full-time, but there's still quite a lot to do. And I think we're particularly concerned that the government implements its policy to end overseas fossil fuel funding as soon as possible. And the announcement made in December was good, but that policy has to be brought into force immediately and without loopholes, because our evidence suggests that it seems the government is still considering spending on new oil and gas projects while the consultation is underway. It was disappointing last week that the Environment Bill has been further delayed, and you will have been shared our briefing for MPs, which was circulated recently. That flagged our concerns at deforestation and the desire to strengthen the bill to ensure private companies operating in the UK are not complicit in deforestation. And obviously, as well as being an environmental issue, deforestation is a poverty and human rights issue. And we've been hearing more and more reports from our partners over the last few months of killings and detentions of human rights and forest defenders. So again, the nature of climate justice is a broad agenda item there. And the third point I wanted to flag with you is around debt. And this is very applicable in terms of the G7 conversations. And it's at the heart, I think, of this sense of building back better or building back fairly. We continue as CAFOD to campaign for the cancellation of all debts, including action on debts owed to private creditors. And this is most relevant for the G7, following the lobbying that we did last year with the G20 finance ministers meeting. And you were brilliant on your support for that with the G20 and with the Chancellor particularly. So you know that this is a critical issue for development. As we discussed last year, COVID has the potential to push over 100 million people into extreme poverty. Now, we do welcome the commitments that have made so far, especially the temporary suspension of bilateral debt to 40 countries. But again, there's still much more to be done, and the burden of debt to private banks and financial institutions still remains. So that's something that we want to continue to push on. We're not on our own, of course. The World Bank President, David Malpass, has already publicly urged private creditors to stop collecting funds that are critically needed elsewhere as a matter of urgency. So many of you know these arguments better than me because of your work involved in this. So thank you for that, and please continue to be posing the questions and asking us to and asking the questions on this. I guess I'm reflecting, because with this year of the G7 and the COP, I'm reflecting back on 2015 when we were working towards the Paris climate negotiations, and how the impact of Pope Francis's contribution through Laudato Si was such a critical intervention and recognised as such by heads of state and diplomats alike. And I think so it must be this year, that perhaps we might not have, we have those documents, we're not going to get a new one, but it's an opportunity for us as people of faith to be really pushing the voices of those who are poorest and usually least recognised in society. It's those voices that have to be heard and those interests that should be our priorities. And I know that as the economy faces its biggest challenges yet, we've got difficult choices ahead. Doesn't that sound familiar? But I think for us, those difficult choices are actually quite straightforward. You know, we choose to care for the poorest. We choose to care for our planet. And that means investing in health and social care, green jobs or renewable energy sources, or strengthening the social safety net, or introducing a basic income, all measures that respect our common humanity. Those things have got to be at the forefront. And it's not new. Over the last year, we have shown that we can and have responded to a rapidly changing world. The changes that we've lived through and are still living through with the pandemic show that just what can be achieved if there is political will. And it's about really monopolizing and capitalizing on that political will that exists. And I'm sure you feel like me that we've gone through too much to simply return to the old normal when the pandemic is over. And Pope Francis calls on us to do that. There's a whole separate talk about, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti and the reset that's needed. But he articulates, I think, what so many people are feeling, that it doesn't have to be like this. We can use our resources more wisely. And I was just on my way back from the doctors this morning, bumped into my parish priest who said exactly the same thing. He's like, surely we can do this differently. So I think there's that sense, and I'm sure your constituents feel it too. So in this year of the G7, what does building a better normal mean? For the G7, it means rethinking those debt ties that bind so many. In the year of COP, it means making sure that the money that governments are pumping into the economy is used to create the kind of green and decent jobs that we need. It shouldn't be about bailing out polluters. And it also means for us about turning our climate ambitions from just vague future targets to immediate cuts in emissions. So it's an opportunity we've got. It's a unique opportunity to reset our economy, our politics and our society, to build a thriving post-pandemic world, fulfilling those principles that are at the heart of what Pope Francis calls for, literally a conversion to a greener, more dignified and more just planet. And thank you for being part of that conversion yourselves.
Thank you, Christine. And in the absence of any other agenda, Chris, are we just going to go to a discussion at this point? So has anyone got any questions they want to put to Christine, or just any thoughts to share with one another? It is nice to have an opportunity to, and I think it's really important that we take the chance to think about how we can do things differently. And I know this is, I think, from a development perspective, but also from a sort of a UK perspective as well. I know that I think all of us as as like in our lives, in our lifestyles, in our families, the way we operate, thinking about actually some of the things that have changed and changed for the better as a result of this crisis, and then some of the things that we would desperately like to return to, and some of the things that actually we didn't give enough attention to, that now that we can no longer, we wish we could. And I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking there, actually, how we've got so used to now operating in this online way that actually there are no international barriers anymore. There's no reason why we can't share the reality of others from other parts of the world on a much more sustained basis than we do now. We've always waited till we can visit, or people can visit here, and obviously at the moment you can't be out and about with your mobile phone, but actually in the future I don't see why we can't really strive to make the world smaller, but in a perfectly sustainable way that we can do through the way that we've become so used to communicating with one another. We can do that on a much more grander scale internationally as well. But in terms of the vaccine, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Christine, because I know that's a big issue for everybody at the moment. It is the focus. It is the building block from which we can all build back better. And so it'd be helpful to hear if you've had any sort of feedback from partners and stakeholders on what the big challenges are in terms of vaccines. I know that as a UK, we have done remarkably well on the vaccine programme, and we do have to be very grateful for that. And we will have a surplus of vaccines, and how the process will work of making sure that they get where they should go and where they need to go, because it is so true that nobody's safe until everybody's safe, and so we do have to work internationally to achieve that. So it'd be interesting to hear if you've got any thoughts on that front. But also, I'm more than happy if people want to put in the chat that they want to come in, or just give me a wave. But I'll hand back over to you, Christine.
Great, thanks very much, Catherine. And I mean, and on that thing about no international barriers, I think that's a really good point. So if you did have a particular country or a particular theme that you wanted to reflect on with some of our with one of our country staff, be absolutely happy. We've been doing a number of webinars with supporters, that involve some of our country staff. So I think that the potential to do that is absolutely there, and we'd be very happy to facilitate that. On the vaccine front, Catherine, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a big thing for us, but actually for some of our partners, it depends where you are around the world. That actually the vaccine isn't their answer. Their answer is actually I want to get out and raise money to feed my family. It's a much more fundamental question, but obviously there is the big issue about access, particularly for and we don't just mean across Europe, but actually for countries around the world. And I think the WHO have been really sensible about this in terms of actually talking about the importance of access and making sure that the rich countries don't just kind of use it up. But it's important to be focused on, in the way that that this government has been very taken the advice of the scientists and the medical profession to focus on the most vulnerable. Well, so that should be kind of globally. So clearly Brazil and South Africa, India have got their own program now. And I guess that is that question about making sure that there's a political voice about making sure that there is greater access, because ultimately it is about access. And obviously making sure that if where possible, countries can get it at a fair and just price too. So I think there is we're part of. We're joining with others, and I think the church people have spoken out about making sure that the access is there and that it's fair, and make sure that it's available to people. I think it really does I know it might sound slightly heretical at the moment, but it really does depend on where you are in the world as to how important the vaccine is. And in some parts of the world, it is much more important than in other parts. So it's about making sure that it's targeted as well as possible. But ultimately, it's got to be, it has got to be something whereby we can reach everybody. I think I'm just reminded that there's still too many deaths from places, from things like smallpox, from things like malaria and getting nets out and those sorts of things. So, as a global community, we haven't actually got that many ticks in the box at dealing with kind of global health pandemics. So perhaps, there are some really important lessons to learn from the COVID experience that we might actually broaden it out more. And thinking about other preventable illnesses that so many people around the world do die from. So
yeah,
happy to take other questions.
Yeah, and so I know Mary wants to come in, and Hilary as well. And I was just thinking, as you were talking there, that there are so many basic health necessities that we just absolutely take for granted here. And I think now that we've all experienced health insecurity the way we have, that everything's not safe and sorted the way we've all become accustomed to, I think it's a real opportunity to open hearts and minds to the reality that is still very much the case for many, many countries around the world that are not in a pandemic. They just don't have the same health and security that we have. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Mary.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Christine. I do think the encyclical from the Pope is very useful. I've got some of the summaries from the main political chapter, if you like, and I guess the Pope is asking for a real radical conversion for government, and from my point of view, it is going to have to be a radical conversion, because it doesn't seem as if this government have it's not really in their DNA to be on the side of the poor and show real solidarity and dignity with the poor, both here and across the UK. And as you pointed out, even just the cuts to the aid budget, the aid budget without actually consulting with aid organisations, cutting universal credit for the people who desperately need it, wanting to cut free school meals for children. It's this government, as I'm sure a lot of people know, have that sort of inherent ideology of the deserving and undeserving poor, and that flies in the face of everything that the Pope is calling out for us to do. And we hear it more with closing borders, this vaccine nationalism that we've talked about, and we know that we won't beat COVID anyway unless we beat it everywhere. So the fight to who's the strongest country to get the vaccine and vaccine as many people as possible, it's such an isolated view. We're not looking further into the pandemic as a whole across the world. So from my point of view and others in the opposition, we've questioned a lot the government and the Prime Minister around some of these issues, but they're not listening. They're not listening at all. And I think that this pandemic has highlighted the huge inequalities that we've seen that have grown over the last 10 years, huge inequalities. And of course, we're in the we've got the worst recession now in any major economy and the worst death rate, and that's because our inequalities in the first place were so bad, and the poor and those with poor health were at a very low level to begin with. So it's no wonder that we're in this state now. So I don't know the answer apart from us continuing to challenge the government and maybe asking some of the Catholics or the Christians who are in the government to actually read this encyclical, and let's hear what they've got to say about it.
Well, he certainly does have a lot to say. He does the Pope does throw down something of a gauntlet to politicians, I have to say. I think when it was written, I think he possibly had America and certainly Brazil sort of in mind, but I think it's as applicable to all of us, and that sense of conversion is I guess at the heart of it. And I guess the only way people will change is to be affected, you know, by hearing the voices. So it is on to all of us to make sure that voices are heard and presented. But yeah.
So I know that Hilary wanted to come in. Oh, there you are. Sorry, Hilary. My screen moved and you moved. And then I know that Chris wants to come in as well after Hilary. So Hilary, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. And as a Methodist, I almost feel I'm intruding here, but I've been a long-term friend of and supporter of CAFOD.
Hilary Armstrong in. Get Hilary Armstrong out of here.
I'm really interested in the whole issue of building back better and how we do it. I'm chairing a committee in the House of Lords, which is on public services, and we look at how COVID has, you know, what we've learned about our public services from the pandemic. And we had a session last week on what finances should be for the future. And I really wanted to have a little word now about young people, because I really do think that is one of the ways in which we can build back better, both here and internationally. So here, we actually had David Willits as one of our witnesses from, he was actually speaking on behalf of the Resolution Foundation, but of course he's a long-term, I knew him as a Tory MP and he's now in the Lords. And he argued that the government had missed the opportunity with the money that it's put in through furlough and kickstart to actually reshape opportunities for young people. And if that money had gone to reskilling or to skilling and upskilling young people for the jobs that are going to be there in the future, that money would have been much more effectively spent. And that got me thinking about international development too, because of course, as all of you that are interested in international development know, most of the developing world is a much younger world than our world. And I know bits of East Africa really well, but I mainly know that, as Christine knows, through VSO. And VSO has changed its model radically over the years. And they've not been sending volunteers during the pandemic, but what they have done is continue to work with their national volunteers. And they now recruit internationally in developing countries, lots and lots of national volunteers, train them, and they become local leaders, really. And when exchanges are working, then there'll be a group from this country of young people go and work with a group from a developing country on a particular issue. I was talking last week to a young woman in Kenya who has been working on youth empowerment, she called it. You know, they're great with all these words, aren't they? And she was working with groups of young people and could show us videos of the work and the excitement of the young people and how she was developing local leaders within local communities, within schools and so on, who were taking hold of the issues that really matter to their community. I talked to another who was doing, it was a young man who was, I think he was in Uganda doing work on sexual health issues, and again was really finding some very radical ways of working in communities with young people in particular, but also with community leaders there around their attitudes, what sort of infrastructure they were setting in and so on. And I never forget someone from West Africa who came to lobby us here after the Ebola crisis about the biggest thing for them was that when the pandemic came, they couldn't get to the biggest hospital in the country. I think it was Sierra Leone, but it might have been next door in Liberia. they couldn't get to the hospital because the roads weren't good enough. And he came here to lobby for money for better road infrastructure, because that was one of the key things for how they could get people moving around the country and get bodies moved around and all the rest of it. So we have to learn to look at things in a very different way. And for me, building back better has got to be around working with local people in their local communities, and particularly young people. And we have to find out how to do that better here, so that they are really well trained for the next role of jobs. But we've also got to do that internationally to build up those local cadre leaders so that they're able to develop and change things. We've got incredible opportunities here, and we really have to make sure we don't throw them away.
Thanks, Hilary. That was, gosh, an awful lot in there, a lot to take away and think about. So there are a number of people that want to come in now. So I was going to maybe take a few comments, and then Christine can come back and comment on them all. But I just, first of all, I know Chris put in the chat box that Captain Tom Moore has sadly died, and just to share that news, and that may he rest in peace. What a life well lived, and what an impact he made on everybody. So I know, Chris, did you want to come in next?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Christine, for your introduction. Now, I'd like to just make the opening point. To be Catholic, you don't have to be a socialist. So I think that's really important. We're going through a bit of a global crisis, and I voted against this current lockdown. One of the reasons is you can see the impact, for example, it's having on children. You can see it's reported now the self-harm that children have, the damage it's doing to their education. They've already lost 3 months last year, with a number of other occasions where they're losing 2 weeks in the year groups or classes, 2 weeks at a time. So some children would have lost a month and a half, perhaps last year. They're losing 3 months this year to begin with, and perhaps more down the line. So just from the perspective of children, we have such a difficult position to even consider building back better, when our starting point is, by the approach we're having with lockdown, we're damaging so many people's lives. And children is just one aspect. There's a huge multitude of other aspects. So we're having to look, I think, into financially, a huge cost is going down the line. And that's going to require a huge national debate in terms of what kind of society we want. Now, parallel to that, you've got the COP26 and the climate change agenda, which I would argue is incredibly expensive. Now, on the one hand, I have people from the steel industry. I have a factory in the constituency. The steel industry is saying, look, the cost of energy, the cost of these climate change measures means we shut down industry, manufacturing industry in the UK, and it goes to China, and it emits far more carbon if it goes to China or India or other places around the world. So if at the same time we're closing businesses, manufacturing businesses, and losing their jobs in the UK, how do we pay for this recovery?
Okay. A lot to think about there as well. Fleur, did you want to come in?
Hi, Catherine. Yep, thank you very much. Thanks for chairing, Catherine, and nice to see you, Christine, and everyone here. And thank you very much for giving us just time to reflect and think how we can build back better and reflect on the Pope's words. I'm an Anglican, Hilary, and I'm allowed to be here, so up the Protestants. I've been a long-term supporter.
Are there any Catholics on here at all, Catherine?
I've been a long-term supporter of CAFOD. In fact, I used to work for CAFOD. So I've seen the amazing work, the amazing partners around the world, and I have huge respect for them. And knowing what they're going through at the moment is really, really worrying. So thanks for all that you do, Christine, in leading CAFOD. Just a couple of reflections, really. So, and especially reflecting on what I've heard from constituents. Obviously, the issues about health are really prominent now. So that connection with health projects abroad and health projects here, with hand washing abroad and the need for it, which it was hard to make that connection before. Now it's really, really understood. The need to get schools back abroad and here, that really resonates now. And yet we are a hurting nation who's been through so much. And so the ability to think about things around the world as well as things at home is, I think, much more limited. So, I mean, you know this more than me, but that's definitely what I'm hearing from constituents. And I had the biggest campaign from Catholic churches that I've had. I'm only been elected just over a year, but a massive campaign for Catholic churches asking for them to stay open during the lockdown. And I thought, I would love you to have been campaigning for CAFOD when you were writing all those letters. So if you can harness the same energy and be encouraging people to campaign in the same way. I heard from so many congregations, members and priests about that. Thought, oh, there's real power in the Catholic Church. They were all writing to their MPs all across the country. And there's something to be said there that they felt that they should write to their MP. Their MP is important. And so that is something which continues in the things that you were talking about the aid cuts. And if anything that you can tell us about what you're seeing on the ground as this unfolds, about the actual impact of aid cuts, would be really important for us to be able to raise in the House about climate justice in these important meetings. I'm so glad that you're still campaigning on debt, because for a country to be so hamstrung to continue to pay out on interest payments for policies so many years ago and mistakes in the financial system is a real crime. So I'm really glad that you're still campaigning on that. And my question is to you about the G7. What would you like to see if you had anything that you could achieve at the G7? Maybe you don't know this quite yet, but what would be your demands of the G7? What would you like to see coming out of that? But thank you.
Brilliant. Are you happy for me to keep going? Because there's quite a few people that want to come in. So I've got Tony Lloyd and then Conor.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, just a couple of points really. I mean, just on Fleur's point really about debt relief, or anyway, Christine's point about debt relief. You know, to me, it's always seemed to be something of a no-brainer that I would rail against the idea of bonded labour being transmitted down the generations, as we know applies in India, or the concept of slavery, and yet intergenerational responsibility for debt seems to become an accepted phenomenon in this world. And of course, we know that debt in parts of the developing world is crippling on any future generation. By and large, the developing world is young. The debts were generated by those who are dead or anyway of an older generation. So we have to rethink that global model. But anyway, that's the one thing that does seem to me. What I wanted to ask Christine really is that I like this Pope, I say, and haven't necessarily been totally in love with all popes during the course of my own life, some better than others. John the 23rd was pretty good. This one is pretty good. Because actually he's optimistic about the world, and that really does make a difference. Because I think even in the politics of Europe, the politics of what we regard as the developed world rather, pessimism is probably as rife as optimism, and we've got to get back to an optimistic politics that we can change the world for the better, and it has to be for the better. But on the back of that, really, I did wonder, this is a question for Christine, whether post-COVID, when I think we've all learned that actually we really are in COVID altogether, however we do it, that the capacity for a virus to mutate in some parts of the world we don't even think about at the moment, means that if we don't solve the COVID crisis globally, then we don't solve it for any of us. Whether there is an opportunity now to say in building back better, there is a chance for optimism. There is a chance actually in countries like this to say to our population, don't just respond to crisis, but respond to building, and respond to Hilary Armstrong's point, respond to building by investing in the young people of the world, by investing in the kind of infrastructures that liberate the talents of young people, because in the end, that's the optimistic agenda that I kind of grew up on, but I think has been missing a little bit over the years. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. And then I'll bring Conor in.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Christine, to you and your colleagues in CAFOD for all the work that you do and the incredible witness that you give. It really is, it's inspirational. And I think in what Tony says, I agree entirely that there are causes for optimism, not just from the Pope and what he wants to do in terms of the church's direction, but also what he's providing to the world in terms of leadership on these issues. And I think the election of President Biden is another step in that direction, and a really important one for our church, I feel too, not just in the cultural references that we will now see underpin his presidency. And we saw that from the speech he gave the night he was elected to his inauguration and the influence it has there, but also I think the direction it will help take the church in terms of, I suppose, what Cardinal Bernardin, the Archbishop of Chicago, would have called the consistent life ethic and the seamless garment, with a significant focus on economic and social justice. So that's how I feel at the minute. Despite everything, I think there are great causes for optimism. But as a sort of typical old Labour right trade unionist, I want to ask a question about organising, actually, because that's the macro. But I wanted to ask you and some advice, really, because I see my 6-year-old who comes home from school and he goes to a Catholic school where they talk about this all the time. You know, climate change is something that is just completely embedded in everything that they do, for example. But I don't see the connection between that and what we do at a parish level. And I know and I understand that some dioceses and archdioceses and parishes will be, how do I say this diplomatically, more dynamic than others. But in a place like St. Helens, and I see my colleague Mary Rimmer on the call, there is a more traditional parish setup where there are loose networks. They're not formalised. We don't have a particularly strong CAFOD or JNP presence. We mark Racial Justice Sunday, Prisoners Sunday, Climate Week and all of that. But I mean, I've made a conscious effort to include these issues, particularly climate, when I speak to groups in my constituency, faith groups from all denominations and indeed all religions, and schools as well. But I just was wondering, is that something that CAFOD could think about in turn? Look, I know the resources are finite, and there definitely aren't enough loaves and fishes to go around on this one. But I just think if there was a way that we as leaders in our own communities could work, not just in my case, obviously the first point of contact is with my own church, but also with other faith groups on this, to make sure that we're translating from that sense of optimism at the macro, responsibility and duty on legislators at a national level, but also then at a local level, about really embedding all of this in our local communities, not just our local faith communities, but our entire communities.
Thanks, Conor. So, Christine, I think that's probably enough anyway to be responding to, but obviously we've got a few minutes, so if anyone else wants to come in, just put it in the chat box.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Gosh, lots of questions. I'll work backwards, might be easier. So Conor, I think absolutely right. And I think there's a huge amount of optimism around the world despite everything. And that is also part of what our, oh, sorry, Lisa, do you want to come in before I get stuck in?
No, I mean, if you wanted to answer Conor, I'm just was going to raise something about the disability all-party group and some work on the SDGs, but answer Conor first, and I'm happy to wait.
Sure, because I was gonna go through and take all of them as best I can.
Oh, do you want me to? Well, it was just to say that I mean, usually when we're in Parliament, we do quite a lot of work with the Department for International Development in the all-party group for disability, looking at the Leave No One Behind agenda, and I'm really concerned as chair of that group, about people with disabilities in developing countries. I think with the funding crisis at DFID just now, I'm really concerned that we will be leaving the most vulnerable behind, and particularly people with disabilities, when the UK actually were doing so well in terms of leadership on those issues internationally, in development, and I think leadership that's been shown by the Pope and that's on the ground in terms of the work that CAFOD are doing is invaluable to that. So anything that our APPG can help with, we would be really keen to do so.
Great, thanks. I think, as I said before, I think there's still some serious questions to be asked about the impact of the cuts in the aid budget. I think, and particularly about who is most affected by that, and where you've got commitments that have already been are being kept, quite rightly, with the multilaterals, then that like limits where the rest of the money can go. And I think the more that you can put pressure on the FCDO to actually remind them about their commitments to localization and to funding local organizations are absolutely critical. And because what you'll find is, particularly with disabilities and with other marginalized groups, is that they're the smaller organizations that are offering the support. And my real fear is that there's less money for civil society organizations in the desire to have big projects and get stuff out. And so I think there's some real questions that need to be asked there. I think I want to go back to Conor and the issues about embedding it. I guess and it links in, I think, to Fleur's point about the fact that the Catholic Church kind of like can mobilize people writing letters on keeping churches open, and they can't on things like debt relief. But that's part of what we're here for as CAFOD, is to try and harness that energy. And so this year our campaign's focus is very much around the G7 and of course the COP, and it's under the banner of reclaiming our common home. So we've got I'm sure we'll send you the link to the video, and we've got a petition and various things, and we're just kind of encouraging churches to get engaged. And obviously, as the year progresses, we'll be continuing to keep that kind of climate justice message throughout all our work, and particularly in things like our fast day moments, again focused in on things like water access or issues that are very strongly related to climate. It's slightly a testimony, though, isn't it, Conor, that I'm the same. My daughter's 15, so on those odd occasions when she does deign to talk to me, it invariably is a sort of slight lecture on how I've let the world down. So it is part of the dynamic, and as Hilary pointed out, it is about the young people who are kind of who are challenging us. And I think that is the lesson that we've kind of just got to suck up and find our ways to make sure that we're connecting. But it's not easy. In the parish context, and I'm involved in a couple of different kind of conversations around how does the church build back better, not hosted by the Bishops' Conference, I should add, but independent sort of bits. Thank you, Andrea, for sharing the link there. And as Hilary put in the chat, our role in things like sort of debt and our campaigning, we've got our own campaign with our own supporters, but we're very much part of the wider family, if you like, and working with other organisations, particularly around the G7 and the COP. We have to do it with others. We can't just do it on our own. So we are really looking at that. In terms of how we are working with others around the coordination and the role and contribution of faiths. And we are looking to get faith leaders to be speaking out kind of in advance of the COP, not just here in the UK actually, but around the world. So it's about making sure that when you've got those, as you know, it's about the local contributions, it's about the development plan, the determined contributions that individual countries make. That sort of like preliminary diplomatic work before a COP is so critical. So for us, trying to get faith leaders speaking up in those early stages and getting the agendas critical for us. Fleur, you asked me about the wish list for the G7. Well, climate is part of it, but climate financing, it's about making sure that that's just, you know, that the rich nations kind of do have to stump up, and I'll come on to your point about that, Chris, later. The debt relief is absolutely critical, as I flagged. I think also the recognition about how are we using the money that we've got. So, you know, things like the fossil fuel financing that I talked about before. But the thing that we've learned about COVID, as you've all talked about, is that it's a global issue and it needs a global response. So, you know, the work of people like the World Health Organization and the UN are really important. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not criticizing the government for funding multilaterals, because actually we have to work together to be able to achieve this, the solutions that we need. And I think that's part of the issue about a strengthened sense of multilateralism. And that's why I think, you know, as you said, Conor, about Joe Biden in the White House, you know, America bringing in a stronger sense of, yes, we want to be part of the world rather than separate to it, is so critical. And I have to say, I think, you know, Britain needs to remember how much of a part of the world, you know, we are. And I think we have had a feeling of a bit more isolation over the last few years than perhaps we've needed to. And so I think the G7 and the COP being under our presidency is really critical. It's a critical opportunity for us to be able to talk about the way in which we can really fix some of those international institutions and work together, and to make sure that perhaps everyone steps up to the plate in terms of our global commitments to things like 0.7. But Chris, you raised that really important point, is how do we pay for this recovery? And I think, you know, gosh, I'm not an economist. I'm a rather simple person when it comes to these sorts of things. But, you know, the government has choices, we all have choices. And, you know, as I said before, I found the financial argument for reducing 0.7 to 0.5 rather hollow when it came just 2 or 3 weeks after a very big increase in defence spending. And I think, you know, you're right to use the example of, you know, the Sheffield steel industry. And I think this is part of the challenge for us around needing to have a phased and a worked through transition. And, you know, we've got the Committee on Climate Change that's been working for many years with some very, very practical proposals about the way in which we have to retool and reconfigure our economy. There are green jobs. There are potential for that, but it's a question about how do we make that transition happen. Now, I'm not, as I say, I'm not an economist and I'm not an expert on the domestic agenda, but I do think that there are people who are, and I think, you know, the work of the Climate Change Committee has been very detailed in relation to that. But I do think your point about the fact that there's a need for a national conversation about what sort of society we want, I think that's absolutely critical. And in some respects, it could be a real opportunity for us to come together. You know, how divisive our narrative has been over the last few years has been really saddening, you know, and regardless of where you are on a political spectrum or on a kind of in, out, leave, remain, whatever you are, the nature of our narrative has been incredibly, has been pulling us apart. And I think there's a real need for us to find a space in politics and in our political narrative that brings us together, that finds our common humanity, that finds our connectedness and our community, which so many people have experienced. You know, I'm in my local area, you know, it's all of the faiths are out there working together, where, you know, providing food and looking after neighbors, and people are experiencing that community. It's not as divisive as it was. And I think maybe this is just a bit of a pipe dream, but I think, you know, to have that kind of space politically for that kind of debate and discussion would be, for me, so key. I think Hilary, your point about, you know, young people and the approach of VSO about kind of helping to develop young leaders and really building on local communities is absolutely critical. And it's also it's something very important for CAFOD. Our whole approach is about building up and supporting the local partners. They're the experts. They're the people who know what we're doing. We don't fly people around the world to do development to people. We support and fund existing partners who are embedded in their local communities, who are churches, who are local organizations. And they're the local organizations that, you know, what we'd like to do is to help them access more funding, to help them kind of grow and develop. So that it's their voices, it's their work that's done. You know, they're the ones. And Pope, was it Paul VI, in Popular and Progressive, talks about people being artisans of their own destiny. What a fantastic phrase that is. That's our vision, that people are artisans of their own destiny, not just passive recipients of my largesse when I choose to give it. You know, it's that sense of a different kind of world. And, you know, that starts right from the very beginning. So I'll leave it there because I know where my weak points are.
No, you've done very well, because we've just landed very nicely on the end of the meeting. Thanks so much. That was a really rich discussion, and I feel like we've travelled right around the world and come back home and actually got an awful lot of good ideas for how we can improve things starting here, and then working to make a better world for everybody. So there's certainly plenty of food for thought. And thanks so much for your time, Christine. And thank you, Chris, for organising all of this. And it's been good to have the combination of the two groups. I think it's a good format that works. So thank you, Chris, for setting that up. And Chris has said that the event will be recorded. It has been recorded, and a link will be shared. So thanks, everybody, and take care. And I'm sure we will see one another virtually. It's likely to be soon.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Bye.